Have you ever thought to yourself, man, I would really love this specific augment, but for some reason it never showed up? Well, this might not be the usual RNG messing up your game, but instead it might be caused by you not fulfilling a specific condition. Fortunately, there are only a few rules you need to learn to give yourself the best chances at getting the augment you want. But just before we get started, set 8 is only a few weeks away and I fully intend to take it apart. If you want to be the first to learn all of the secrets of set 8, then why not subscribe and stay ahead of the curve. Enough of the intro, let's get into it. As you might know, augments in TFT are offered in stage 2.1, 3.2 and 4.2. You as a player have no control at all about your options in stage 2. It is fully random and you pretty much just have to deal with it. However, this is not the case for stage 3 and 4. In the round before the augment selection, meaning stage 3.1 and 4.1, the units you have on your board will actively influence all the possible augments you can receive. You also have the option to reroll your augments, but that outcome is influenced by your current board. This means you can change up the board before rerolling and influence your augment selection again. But let me be perfectly clear, there is no way to force a specific augment. Instead, we have to think of it in terms of it's possible to show up and it's impossible to show up. There are different reasons why an augment is able to show up. It doesn't only have to do with your units, but it can also be decided by your current stage, items on your board, and previous choices you've made. Since there are so many augments in the game, and I don't really want to go over them one by one, I decided the best way is to categorize them. Since this involves a lot of data, I put the sheets that I'm using in the description of this video. Now let's take a look at what can prevent an augment from appearing. First up, we have the trait conditions. These are very simple to understand. The only rule you have to remember is this. If an augment has anything to do with a trait, it can only show up if that trait is activated. Just to make a few examples, a bruiser crest can only appear if you're running at least 2 bruisers, because they activate the trait. And in similar fashion, something like Scourge could only appear with at least 2 Rage Wings, or something like Soul Siphon will require you to have the Darkflight trait activated. In set 6, this used to work somewhat differently. Back then, to receive something like a Heart or a Crest, it was only necessary for the augment to fill up the trait. This means all you had to do was run something like 2 mutants, and then it opened up the possibility of receiving a mutant crest. But this is not the case anymore. We do have 2 exceptions for this rule, with Guild being one of them. Here we have Guild Heart, Crest Crown, and gear upgrades as potential augments. If Guild would follow the same rule as the other trait-specific augments, then players would constantly receive Guild augments simply from including something like a Sejuani on their board. This is why you need to have at least 2 different guild units or Zippy on your board to receive one of these augments. Another special rule I should mention is Mystic Soul. This one is unique since, as far as I know, it is the only trait-specific augment currently in the game that always has a chance of appearing. The second category I wanted to look at is the stage condition. Augments belonging to this category might also have other conditions, but the one thing they have in common is that they can't appear throughout all the stages in the game. Some augments will only appear in stage 2.1, like Calculated Loss or March of Progress, because they only make sense if you run them at the start of the game. Others, on the other hand, could be considered too weak or too strong at different points in the game. I mean, if you think about it, would you want someone getting a golden egg in stage 2? Doesn't really sound that fair, does it? Now, I don't want to go over all of the augments, since they're pretty easy to figure out by using tactic.tools, but I do want to highlight the more interesting ones. Something that is a little bit more on the recent side is that you cannot get a build different in stage 4 anymore. In previous patches, the only players who would be offered build different this late in the game are the ones who were already running it. This ended up giving them a huge boost in combat stats without any downsides. Riot decided they finally had enough of this and put an end to it. Double Trouble also falls into this category. It was usually very popular, especially favored in Darkflight, Scale Scorn, and the old Astral comp. If you're looking for this augment, especially if you intend to reroll your augment selection, you should know that the lowest tier, Silver, can only show up in stage 2, and none of them can show up in stage 4. Think Fast was also recently removed from stage 2, so if your first choice is prismatic, you can now take all the time in your world to make your decision. Now the final category is probably the most interesting, but also the most difficult one to figure out. From here on, you should take everything with a grain of salt, unless it gets confirmed by Riot. So let's take a look at unique conditions. We start with build different again, but for a good reason. It would be pretty awkward for build different to show up in stage 3 if you're running a lot of traits, which is why this augment can only appear if you have a maximum amount of 2 active traits on your board. This is the reason why it used to be so common for build different players to find this augment more than once, because they kept fulfilling the condition. We also have the opposite of build different. These are confirmed augments that cannot show up anymore if you've taken build different as a previous choice. Here we have stuff like Dragon Imperialist, Dragon Soul, Age of Dragons, or with the latest patch, other tiers of build different. Something interesting about this rule is that it apparently does not apply to emblems, but since they can only show up if their trait is activated, this kind of never causes a problem, so you don't have to worry about it. On the other side of build different, we have Stand United. This one has a much easier condition to fulfill. You need to run at least 3 active traits. This is obviously super easy to achieve, which is why this augment will constantly show up in your selection. But you know, since it's a pretty solid combat augment, it's not really the worst thing that can happen to you. Now, as you know, some augments have different tiers, but it's not possible to stack all of them. Here we have, as I previously mentioned, build different, but also Double Trouble, Trade Sector, Windfall, Rich Get Richer, Preparation, Blue Battery, Future Sight, and Scoped Weapons. Also, I might be mistaken here, but as far as I can tell, this category also includes First Aid Kit and Big Friend. Speaking of Big Friend, from what I could gather, it looks like it has a unique condition of needing at least 1 high HP unit on your board for it to appear. This is to ensure that you can make use of the augment right away, and is also the reason why it can't show up in stage 2, since you're unlikely to have a high HP unit this early in the game. Next up, we have the cybernetic augments. This includes the cybernetic implants, shell, and uplink. As I mentioned in a previous video, for cybernetic augments to appear, you need to have at least 3 components on 3 different units. Otherwise, they can't show up. You can obviously have more items, and both shimmer scale and emblems and stuff like this will be accounted for. The only important thing here is that you have 3 different units with some sort of an item. Featherweights is also an interesting augment since it is based on early game units, so it kinda makes sense that it only gets offered if you run a lot of them. As far as I can tell, the condition for this augment to appear is to run a minimum of 4 tier 1 and or tier 2 units on your board. If you really don't like this augment and you don't want it to appear, make sure to put in more tier 3 units, especially when you're looking to reroll your augments. As a bit of an honorable mention, we also have positional augments, in this case Knife's Edge and Battle Mage. This is honestly more of an interesting fact and not something you would actively make use of, but if you have the Mage trait activated, you can't receive Knife's Edge, and the same thing applies to Swift Shot blocking Battle Mage. This is just to prevent a scenario to help players from getting screwed over. And last but not least, we have Triforce. Compared to set 6, this augment has been quite rare, but the condition for it to appear is surprisingly simple. All you need is a minimum of 3 tier 3 units on your board, and it might decide to show up if it feels like it. Now, I don't believe that my current list is both perfectly accurate or complete, and there are definitely choices you can make in your game that will end up closing the door on other augments. I would love to hear from you in the comment section about other conditions that you were able to figure out, and point out some dumb mistakes I might have made. I hope you learned something, and see you next time.